This mission is a high-tech thrill ride that will test our pilots and crewmen as never before. Its success and their survival will depend on teamwork. Intelligence people to find the target. Combat air patrol fighters to fend off the enemy interceptors. Electronic warfare aircraft to confuse ground defenses. And attack aircraft to deliver the bombs and missiles. To be ready, these men need constant, realistic training, not only in their own aircraft, but as an integrated inter-service force.
For the bomb run brief here, this will be a sink, SHRAM, targets 1, 2, and 4. IP here. First target is a no-show on the side of the ridge, a couple offsets, tips of lakes. Is mag heading at 245, time of 3 minutes, 44 seconds. Target 1 to target 2, we have a mag heading at 247 for 1 minute and 10 seconds. Target 2 is an airfield runway, just in the edge of a small valley.
The thorough preparation that air crews received today during peacetime was only a dream to the military planners of my era. I've seen it, and I ought to know. I joined up at a very different time. It was in the spring of 1941. Along with an eager group of West Point graduates, enlisted men, and civilian candidates, I reported for duty to Randolph Field. The government had just announced its plan to train 30,000 new pilots. This was planning ahead. At that time, the Army Air Force had on hand little more than 1,000 combat aircraft. After arrival, we were issued our uniforms and a rifle. This was the real beginning of our military training, though we had already received primary flight training from civilian flight schools under contract to the government. There was a buzz in the air. Question on everyone's mind was not would we go to war, but when. Hitler was gobbling up Europe, and the Japanese had disputed our ban on the sale of aviation fuel and equipment to feed their war against China. The United States was officially neutral, but President Roosevelt had just pushed through the Lend-Lease bill over the protest of congressional isolationists, so material aid was available to Britain, Greece, and China. All my life, I wanted to fly airplanes. I remember the thrill my brother and I felt watching air races as young boys. The early 1930s had been hard times for our family, but we kept our imaginations in high gear, reading about the latest advances in aviation. New planes were built of stressed aluminum now, and they had retractable landing gear to make them streamlined. The Army built bigger and better bombers. The cockpits were still open, but they carried their bombs on racks inside the fuselage. Famous personalities like Amelia Earhart and Lucky Lindbergh were constantly in the news, setting each other's records on air by flying higher, farther, and faster with each new year. There were even some who said that the airplane was reaching the zenith of practicality. Lighter than airships would be the future. But for the man on the street, the daily news was grim and foreboding. With barely 2 decades since the last war, the Depression was here, and another war was coming. At Randolph Field, we were immersed in months of training, a lot of it on the ground. Radio and code work, textbook aerodynamics, everyone was short of equipment. War games were held with trucks dressed as tanks and mortars and machine guns that were, in truth, the most elementary mock-ups imaginable. Our primary flight trainers had been an oddball assortment of low-powered biplanes, but we were favorably impressed with our basic training aircraft. The BT-9s sitting on the field that first day were in fact obsolete, officially replaced by more advanced trainers which had yet to arrive. But we weren't going to argue with our instructors over such fine points. This was why we had come here, the chance to soar into the sky behind the stick of an all-metal monoplane, to dive through the clouds, to fly with the birds. In those days, when commercial air travel was still an exotic extravagance of the idle rich, we chosen few were entering a fabulous new adventure. For 30 minutes in the sky, we owned the world. After the basic trainer, those of us who hadn't washed out were given advanced training in AT-6 Texans. Though it didn't look all that different than the basic trainers when it was sitting on the ground, this was a much more powerful aircraft, faster, tougher to fly. This was considerably closer to a combat aircraft in every way, and we loved it. Graduation came all too soon. Only about 60 out of 100 cadets were left of those who had originally entered training. A lot of the guys who were eliminated switched course and became gunners, navigators, or bombardiers in the medium and heavy bombers, so they were still part of the team. But we were pilots, damn happy about it too. We weren't smiling for long. I well remember the white-faced junior officer who came running in with the first news. A group of us huddled around a radio, listening, each in shock. It was real. No more questions, no more wondering. We had been attacked, suddenly, viciously, without warning. And what we had feared, and what we had hoped, would now come to pass. This was war. There was a rush to officially choose sides in those first days. The United Kingdom and most of Latin America declared war on Japan on the same day we did. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and we returned the favor. This was now truly a global conflict. World War II was official. The newspapers were full of Japanese conquests and valiant, futile defensive efforts by small outposts of Allied forces in the Pacific. For us, it was back to training. General Headquarters Army Air Force, known as GHQ, was convinced that properly defended heavy bombers would be able to penetrate any defense the enemy could mount. So the training of bomber crews was the order of the day. Gunners would be an important part of these fortresses in the sky, but since Air Force planners believed that armadas of heavy bombers were the answer, fighters were not of the highest priority in those early days. In addition to the medium and heavy bombers being built by the Army, there was a strong push to develop a superior dive bomber. Everyone knew the incredible stories of Germany's Stuka dive bombers. Pundits had credited them heavily for bringing Norway and Poland to their knees in the early German offensives. The Navy had its SBD-3 Dauntless, but after careful testing, the Army thought the Dauntless too slow, short-ranged, and vulnerable to enemy fighters. They looked instead to a new plane designed in America for the British that had recently gone into production, the P-51 Mustang. The modest performance of its original Allison engine camouflaged the abilities of an elegant airframe. And so, in the spring of 1942, Air Force generals did not think the P-51 an especially promising fighter. They did think, however, that with minor modification, it could be made into a valuable dive bomber. In this new dive bomber, I entered combat for the first time. It was called the A-36. Take a P-51A and add dive brakes, external wing bomb racks to carry up to 1,000 pounds, then make some additional changes to the armament and engine, and you had an A-36. Testing and refinement of tactics took place on bombing ranges in the California desert during the hurried days of 1942. We loaded live ammunition and real bombs on these craft. Our targets were made of paper and wood and California desert sand, not the targets we wanted. Reports kept coming in from overseas, news of battles on Corregidor and dogfights fought by the American Volunteer Group in China. More news came daily. American victories were few and far between. We wanted to hit back, but here we were, still in training. Late in April 1942 came exciting news of the famous Doolittle raid. American B-25 bombers flying from aircraft carriers had succeeded in a surprise attack on Tokyo. The immediate military value of this long shot was debatable, but no one cared. It was a tremendous shot in the arm for our morale. Now we were ready to fly our practice missions. We'd been in training for over a year. Just finding the target would be our first challenge. With our instructions in hand, we climbed aboard and then on signal from the ground, started our engines simultaneously. With engines at full throttle, we separated from the Earth and felt the thrill. Airborne, traveling at nearly 300 miles per hour. We grouped in formation and buzzed our buddies in their tents. That was all the fun we were allowed. From here on out, there must have been 100 things we had to think of at any one moment. Concentration, let nothing slip by, keep one eye on the instruments, another out the window, find the target, and then over we'd go. In addition to dive bombing, we tested a new tactic, approaching our target at sagebrush level. We dropped our practice bombs so that they skimmed and skipped over the desert to their targets. It was a tactic later used to great effect in North Africa. We thought we were ready. We were raring to go. No one lay awake at night questioning what it would be like. We were just a bunch of young kids playing games and learning skills in the desert, the American desert. We were a long way from the real war. Assignment, pilot. Flying A-36 dive bombers with the 27th Light Bombardment Group, 64th Fighter Wing, 12th Air Force. We were stationed in Algeria and French Morocco before we saw combat, then Corba, Tunisia, and after that, Sicily. Italian natives offered grapes and friendship. Mussolini had been removed from power only days before, and these people were happy to see us. America had already been at war for a year and a half, but our group was just beginning to fight. All around us were remnants from the former owners of this airfield, German and Italian aircraft, guns, and a hangar with a picture of Il Duce on the wall. Our group, the 27th, was like a club. We had all the trappings, insignia, a shield emblazoned with a magnolia blossom and a clenched fist, even a motto, intelligent strength. The first A-36s had been in combat for a little more than a month, and we were one of two groups in Sicily. Everyone was anxious watching the performance of this new aircraft. After all this preparation, there was still a surprising amount of makeshift equipment in use. Production and supply were catching up with demand, but the demand was great. We had to work out a lot of details ourselves. The dive brakes on the A-36 didn't work as advertised, so we wired them shut. With everyone suited up, life jackets and all, it was time to go. I don't know if you can imagine what it felt like the first time walking out to my plane. My stomach was in knots. I felt ill and uncomfortable. I woke up that morning and finally realized I'm going up in the air to shoot and kill people, and they're going to try their damnedest to kill me. You buried those thoughts. You took a shovel and buried them down so deep they couldn't come back. Because you knew there wasn't any other way out. And if you let them prey on you, they'd just kill you. You make a mistake, you'd be dead. That simple. Our mission was to support the ground troops by attacking targets at or behind enemy lines. We weren't going on a long trip, just a little way into German-held territory where we could bomb and strafe dug-in positions that could cause extra grief for the advancing ground troops. Before we knew it, we were there, and over we went for the first dive, 5,000 feet straight down. From time to time, we could see tracers coming back at us, but mostly we just kept our eyes on our targets. The first several times, you could taste the fear in your mouth, but after a while, it started to go away. Funny how that is. Didn't make it any safer, but just the fact that you'd met the enemy head-on and gotten away clean a couple of times, suddenly your heart was no longer doing jumping jacks in your throat. Another target. A German-held concrete pillbox nestled in the hills with a view down a long valley. Narrow slots for windows. Tiny fortress that could withstand anything less than a direct shot right through the slot. We lined up and made our passes again and again until we either ran out of ammunition or hit pay dirt. And there it was, a telltale line of smoke. One shot had found live ammo inside the bunker and the whole place was up in flames. Going home again, I had to remind myself not to get careless on landing. Too easy to get sloppy. My life and $60,000 worth of airplane depended on doing it right. This was only the first of nearly 100 sorties we'd fly in our first month, a small but important part of the whole effort. With the group together on the ground again, it was time to relax for a few minutes and clean up. My crew chief would look at flak damage on my plane, sometimes very little, sometimes a lot. I could grab some grub while they refueled the planes, then it was back to work. 2, 3, sometimes 4 missions a day. We continued in the Mediterranean for the duration of the war. Our air support mission was successful and popular with the troops, but as Allied air capability increased, first priority was given to long-range attacks on Germany. To increase our flexibility, we converted to fighters equipped with bomb racks and became the 27th Fighter Group. By the end of the war, we were flying P-47s. Still the same group of guys, though. Those of us who were left. Those missing were replaced by the new guys who came along.
I was a career naval aviator. We were training at the Naval Weapons Center at China Lake, California. Our mission was to project the firepower of the U.S. Navy ashore, to support troops and disrupt enemy communications and lines of supply. That's an A-4 Skyhawk, the type of aircraft in which I spent a large portion of my career. A beautiful, compact, tough little bird. A pleasure to fly. The old A-1 there is dropping parachute flares that'll be used for air-to-air target practice. Rescue of downed pilots was also part of training. Any and every skill that might be needed in combat. Training isn't like school where you go until you've learned a skill. Training is constant. You don't just learn it, you master it. You work till you think you know everything there is to know, then you go back to the beginning and start over again. The men and women of naval aviation are a special breed. Their air base is like no other. It doesn't stay in one location, but moves with the shifting tensions and conflicts that trouble our world. In 1965, the conflict was in Southeast Asia, the country called Vietnam. My squadron was embarked upon the USS Independence, a Forrestal-class carrier, home to nearly 5,000 personnel and 80 aircraft. On this floating base, we would travel 12,000 miles from port to join Task Force 77 in the South China Sea. The band played, and I watched and listened to the traditional rites that accompany the separation of sailors from their families. Families they leave behind for months at a time in order to devote themselves to the work that forms their livelihood, the community of the ship. Tearful separations were all the more intense because this time we sailed into combat. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution of 1964 that precipitated our major commitment to the Vietnam War was passed in response to an attack on an American ship. Our squadron would be flying combat missions. We knew that, inevitably, some of the men who shipped out that day would not return. The voyage lasted 3 months. Our course took us around Cape Horn. We crossed the equator twice and passed by Madagascar and Sumatra. Through the routine of life aboard ship, we continued to train. The workday began with food, but the schedule was busy. Before long, we reported for the morning briefing. As many as 10 different briefings might be happening in ready rooms throughout the ship at one time.
Roll out and proceed on ahead, and this will be the airplane on which the others will rendezvous.
On the deck above, crews were pumping thousands of pounds of jet fuel into aircraft that were destined to leave and return to deck 9 or 10 times that day. Cameras, ordnance, wing tanks, everything we might need on a mission was moved, fitted, prepared, and double-checked in preparation for our flight. Space for aircraft is always at premium on a carrier. Simply arranging all the aircraft on the flight deck and hangar deck so that they can be ready when needed for fixing, fueling, and flying requires a constant stream of decisions and careful coordination.
Back there, one of them. Our hangar flight. On this next race spot, we're going to need 402, 310, and 408. 10 minutes to line, 10 minutes. Hey, Dave, did you get that 409 here before I attack?
At last, the first flight of planes was positioned for takeoff for our first training mission of the voyage. Flight deck directors and catapult officers controlled our every move. A heliborne rescue team stood by in case an accident left one of us in the sea. Two seconds down the deck, then airborne. Every 30 seconds, another plane was sent aloft. 16 planes of varying type took off in quick succession. In the heat and steam and noise of the flight deck, men leaned into wind and jet exhaust and called over headsets for the next aircraft to take its place on the catapult. One after another, they made the short trip into the sky. Training flights utilized a mix of aircraft like that we expected to use in combat. In addition to my A-4, the Independence carried the first A-6 intruders with sophisticated electronics and radar to be deployed to Southeast Asia. F-4 Phantoms were tasked with defending the ship against airborne threats and escorting the bombers to their targets. Training missions also included plenty of landings, one of the most difficult and dangerous parts of a carrier pilot's career. More than a third of the naval aircraft lost during the Vietnam War were non-combat losses. Landing accidents were a part of that figure. A successful landing on a moving carrier deck is a challenge under even the best of circumstances. 4 cables stretch across the deck. You aim for the third one. Immediately on hitting the deck, you slam the throttle forward while waiting for the tug of the cable on the hook. If you don't get it right away, you've got a few hundred feet to get airborne. That's your only chance. Then you come around again. On the deck, they wait and watch. If you're not doing something right, you'll hear from the LSO on the radio. But no one can land the plane for you. A successful landing requires the concentration, nerve, and skill of the pilot. Nothing can substitute for that. We arrived 100 miles off the coast of Vietnam in June of 1965. It was the time of Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder was the name given to the systematic bombing of North Vietnam. Our squadron of A-4 Skyhawks was a part of the action that had begun in March and in its first phase continued with increasing intensity through the arrival of the monsoon season and was then halted in December. These missions, in concert with the Air Force, were strategic in nature. The list of targets included radar sites, bridges, rail lines, roads, barracks, truck parks, and factories. Another list, equally as long, contained targets that were off limits for political reasons. These choices would ultimately make this war very different from what we had expected. On board ship, however, we were neither interested nor equipped to draw broad conclusions about the war as a whole. We were much too busy in detailed preparation for what would likely prove the most important moment of our lives, our first attack on enemy territory.
6 is down, 506 is down. This is Event 2 Bravo. Our mission will be an escort and flak suppression of a coordinated attack composed of 4 A6s and 8 A4Ds. Now, some of the things that we should be ever mindful about in this escort is a good lookout doctor.
They have all the information on the board here. All right, now we'll get into the actual attack portion of the flight. We'll be proceeding into the target on a heading of 090.
The briefing we received that morning was anything but brief. When we went to our waiting Skyhawks, we carried in our memories a detailed account of every step we would take for the next several hours. Each of us, climbing into his plane, knew that the coming mission would prove the culmination of all training. No matter how many years of preparation stretched behind us, the future depended upon each man's ability to stay cool and collected, and to successfully draw on demand from the skills hammered into our conscious minds hundreds and hundreds of times before. In those moments before takeoff, I sat in my cockpit, canopy up, forcing my concentration on the job at hand. I knew I would not be flying alone. Many other men had a part in placing my A4 in combat. Mechanics, radar trackers, intelligence officers, flight deck crew, many, many others. All of them waiting and watching now as the moment of truth approached. Time to go. The first part of this mission was routine. With all craft airborne, we grouped up and headed toward our targets in North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese had effective radar. They would know we were coming, though they wouldn't know our exact target. The flight leader used his radio to report in as we passed over the Vietnamese coast. On board ship, our progress would be tracked all the way to the target and back. Information was collected and interpreted in the CIC, or Combat Information Center. We were tracked by the ship's own radar and radar in an E-2 Hawkeye, which served as the airborne control center and the ship's early warning system. Our mission was to disrupt enemy supply lines by removing a bridge that spanned a large river. The weather was good, and we found the target with no trouble. My A4 responded quickly and cleanly as we pulled into a fast dive. The airspeed indicator was climbing steadily while the ground came up to meet us. Everything happened so fast. I twisted my Skyhawk around until the bridge was firmly in my sight. The plane shook slightly, buffeted by the forces required to push through highly compressed air as I neared the speed of sound. Now, I pressed the button to pickle the bombs, pilot lingo for dropping them in the old pickle barrel precisely. A good hit. That's what they told me later. I didn't have time to look back just then. As I was pulling out of my dive, the other Skyhawks behind me were adding their arguments to the conflict. On my way out, something caught my eye. Bright muzzle flashes from a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft battery, something I'd seen only in reconnaissance photos until now. Someone loaded with missiles sent one their way as we maneuvered to avoid the flak that was coming closer to us. Another A4 met a barrage of anti-aircraft fire practically head-on. He could feel the vibrations as small caliber rounds hit his plane. His wingman fired a missile that appeared to go way off course. They dropped their load of 500-pounders, pulled up, and headed back with us. After we were well off target, we took stock of the situation. The A4 Skyhawk was a tiny aircraft, agile and hard to hit. It had served us well. We were on our way home, where an anxious crew awaited our return. Another A4, equipped as a tanker, was on hand to lend assistance to any plane that returned low on fuel. It was a delicate operation for a tired pilot. Time to keep your nerve about you. No time to relax. We weren't home yet. We kept a tight formation on upwind before breaking at 10-second intervals across the bow and into the landing pattern. We had completed our first mission, and we wanted our return to look clean. There, the white-capped ocean confirmed reports from the carrier about stiff winds. Time to settle in. Careful, clean. Watch the ball. Attitude, power. There we go. Hit the third wire. The hook caught. I was back home. One by one, the other aircraft came in, and one by one, they were successfully trapped. This was the first of hundreds of sorties that we would complete over nearly 6 months before the Independence was relieved by another carrier. In that time, the simple anti-aircraft fire we faced was replaced or augmented by radar-guided surface-to-air missiles at the more important targets. I credit the depth and rigor of my training and the advice of my fellow pilots for my survival in this hostile land. To survive, you must be backed by people you can trust, and you must have trained to the point where the appropriate reaction comes by instinct more than by thought. We did a lot of damage to the country of North Vietnam, but I have never seen any intelligence reports that suggested this had a material effect on supplies to the enemy's troops in the south. The reports suggested the opposite. Nevertheless, the intelligence went up the chain of command, and fresh shipments of bombs kept coming back down to us. Our methods of fighting were sound. The politics that determined the strategy may not have been. That is a lesson for the future. If the future finds our aviation teams as dedicated and well-trained as the men I worked with in 1965, it may have a great deal to be thankful for, indeed.
Today, the physical and mental demands upon combat pilots are greater than ever. To hone a fighter pilot to the keen edge required to succeed in the arena of combat may take as many hours of training as for a medical surgeon. Aircraft are both faster and more maneuverable, electronic warfare more complex, potential threats in the battlefield environment more numerous. Yet I'll stand toe-to-toe with you on this. Our men and women, both ground crew and pilots, are better prepared than ever before. Short of actual combat, they have had the best training in the history of the United States Armed Forces. Braggadocio? It's hard to judge fairly with so many intangibles involved in such a comparison. But let me tell you what's going on at Nellis Air Force Base in the Nevada desert. Then you decide. The exercise was called Red Flag. In 1990, renamed Desert Flag. It's an extraordinary attempt to recreate the battlefield environment from the perspective of air combat. A war game? Yes, but a war game with a difference. My squadron had the opportunity to serve as players in this game. The F-15 Eagles we fly are among the most sophisticated fighters in the world today. But vigilance and skill are still required in massive quantity. And for the uninitiated, surprises can lie in wait at every turn. The Eagle's radar is a case in point. You can see so far, so well, 50 miles up, down, or sideways. It's almost a brain, but there's one direction our radar can't see, straight back.
Control there. After there. You did essentially a level turn there. Second kill, knock it off. Roger, knock it off.
Later in debriefing, this engagement would be taken apart by a group of other pilots, rehashing both the mistake that allowed it to begin and the moves each pilot made in the course of it. It's all a part of Red Flag, a congress of air crew and aircraft from all over. On a given day, you'll find F-4s, A-10s, F-16 Fighting Falcons, A-7 Corsairs, and many others from air bases around the nation and around the globe. Red Flag bears a number of similarities to the U.S. Navy's Top Gun school. Like Top Gun, Red Flag was created as a result of the Air Force's experience in combat over North Vietnam. And like Top Gun, participants fly frontline jet fighters against aggressors that use tactics and aircraft similar to those made by the Soviets. The principal aggressor aircraft has traditionally been the F-5E, a compact supersonic jet fighter not unlike the Soviet MiG-21. For pilots flying their first sorties against the aggressors, it is sometimes called the MiG-5 or the F-5 Humiliator. But unlike Top Gun, air-to-air combat is only the beginning of Red Flag. Other craft you might find there include the venerable A-7 Corsair, a powerful strike aircraft. Also the A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known throughout the service as the Warthog. This is the Air Force's tank killer. or the FB-111, a fighter-bomber born in controversy that has proven itself on the battlefield. Even the B-52, still a mainstay in our defensive strategy, is a part of many red flag exercises. The goal is the simulation of the combat environment, and one natural part of many high-intensity engagements is the number of dissimilar aircraft operating in close proximity to each other. Nellis Air Force Base is used for other missions besides red flag, so it's always busy on the flight line. A few of those other uses have included fighter weapons school, Navy and Marine training, Air Force operational testing and evaluation, and cruise missile survivability training. There isn't much spare time, though. Exercises and briefings are run on a tight schedule, like a real combat operation. Before I knew it, we were firing up those turbojets for a roll down the runway. This was the first of 10 missions I would fly during my days at Nellis. One of the discoveries made during the Vietnam War was that pilots who survived their first 10 missions had a much better chance of surviving the war. In 2 weeks here, I would fly 10 missions. If I was shot down by a MiG or a SAM, I'd at least get to replay the whole thing on video and have a lot of experts telling me what I did wrong. Today's mission, fighter cover for an airstrike. A-10 Warthogs were going to attack a column of 200 Soviet-style tanks and armored vehicles. Along the way, they'd run into some smoky SAMs, surface-to-air missiles fired into the sky, leaving a line of smoke. Sensors would pick up signals from the enemy's radar, signals that mimicked known Soviet types, but the A-10s made their bomb runs, jinking whenever necessary to avoid being shot down. In battle, the sheer quantity of threats can overwhelm a pilot. Red flag exercises are designed to give the jet drivers experience in as busy a situation as possible, while still preserving certain rules of engagement for the sake of safety. After bombing, the A-10s came back to make strafing runs with their 30mm cannons. As fast and nasty a sound as you'd ever want to hear bearing down on you. It was almost over when we got bounced. For the purposes of this mission, we were not using our full complement of radar. If you did, you might never get any experience in a dogfight, and that's part of training. Besides, the real world brings far too many twists of fate. You never know when your radar might foul up. Time to head back. Tomorrow would bring another mission and a different set of threats. The results of a series of red flag engagements are frequently unpredictable. Generally, squadrons visiting for the first time are trounced by the aggressors on their first 1 or 2 hops. Experience teaches its lessons, though, so before very long, it's the aggressors who are likely to take the losses. Then again, before the 10 missions are up, you never know. The aggressors may be allowed to abandon unsuccessful tactics and improvise. To increase the numbers in the game, the aggressors may even get help from various outside sources, including U.S. naval aviators. And when they enter the game, there's no predicting what can happen. It's all a part of training, keeping alert, staying ahead, to be the best we can be.
Whether it's a punitive strike against an outlaw country or covering the evacuation of American citizens, or even supporting an ally under outside attack, our pilots and crews must be ready. There can be no target too remote, no defense too imposing, no mission too difficult. See, realistic integrated training such as this exercise prepares our pilots from all branches of the service for those missions we hope will never be needed. But if the need arises, they will be ready for a mission airstrike.